started momentarily. Good morning to those of you who are joining us on Zoom. If you'll just give us a moment to let everyone enter the Zoom room, we'll get started momentarily. Good morning. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you are well and staying safe wherever you are. This is our 21st webinar since March, and we're pleased to be joined again by so many of you from around the United States and around the world. We're pleased to be the virtual meeting place for the trade community at this time when we can't meet in person. And one of our favorite new traditions is to highlight some of the people who are here in the audience, even if you can't see their faces. So a big welcome today to Nicholas Bramble at Google, Jennifer Dubuisson at Lego, Mary Latimer at Mars, and Clay Lowry at the Institute of International Finance, who I think all of us on this webinar have actually worked with at one time or another. Welcome to them and to all of you. Coming up next Thursday, we have a very special event looking at the future of the WTO with three very special guests, the former US Trade Representatives Carla Hills, Susan Schwab, and Michael Froman. All of them have had major roles in the history of the WTO from its creation in the 1990s through the 2000s until the present era. The following week, we'll do a deep dive to look at the dispute about the WTO's appellate body with a fantastic expert panel discussing possible ways to resolve that issue. If you're watching this today on Zoom, after discussion amongst our panelists, you have the ability to ask questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But with over 200 people on the webinar, it'll be hard to get to all the questions, but we'll do our best. We're glad really to have so many of you join us today for a topic we've heard a lot about in recent months, but hasn't been widely discussed in trade circles, and that's digital services taxes. As someone who worked on tax and trade issues on Capitol Hill, I can tell you that these issues are often looked at by policymakers in different lanes with different staffs. So we couldn't be more pleased than to welcome two of America's most significant leaders on these issues, Grant Aldonis, the former Undersecretary of Commerce, and Pam Olson, the former Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Tax Policy. You should have received an email from us earlier this morning with biographies for the speakers, so I won't do a lengthy introduction of our guests. I know most of the trade community is familiar with Grant and friends with Grant, but they may not know as much about Pam, who's as distinguished in the tax area as Grant is in the trade area. That they've been married for over 40 years just makes it a classic Washington romance of tax and trade. Grant and Pam will be joined by a dear friend of all of ours, Meredith Broadbent, the former chair of the International Trade Commission, who will serve as moderator and marriage counselor for our session. We're so glad you could all join us today. Thank you, Pam, Grant, and Meredith. And with that, Meredith, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Ken. Welcome, everybody. We've got a discussion today of probably one of the largest elephant issues facing the United States, and this is digital services taxes being proposed around the globe, including the UK, major European markets, India, and Brazil. And the United States has just recently exited from the international negotiations at the OECD, which is working to bridge differences. I too started my career near a lot of tax guys at the Ways and Means Committee. I was wedged in a little deskette next to the rock star tax staff. And I feel like things have kind of gone full circle in the sense that maybe tax professionals these days are going to have to defer to a little bit more trade expertise as we all work together to solve this impasse that's really threatening billions of dollars of trade retaliation on both sides of the Atlantic. So to lead us through this discussion of the elevated relationship between trade and tax, we have a husband and wife team of luminary proportions. And I'm going to begin by recognizing Pam Olson.
Thank you, Meredith. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you on the phone. I'll say that dinner table conversations around our house were a little bit different than the dinner table conversations many people probably have had. So much so that our son's first email address was Free Trade 101. So you can see we spent a lot of time in our house talking about trade and the interaction with tax. And over the years, Grant and I have had a chance to work together on some issues like the FISC ETI issue, which was pending before the WTO while I was at the Treasury Department and Grant was at the Commerce Department. Talking from the tax side, I should note that, yes, I was the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy. I am American. I tend to see things through an American lens. I think there's an awful lot out there about the position of other countries with respect to international taxation and the effort that's underway at the OECD to rewrite the rules, as well as the DST. What I think is less out there, because the United States has not chosen to broadcast its position, is the position of the United States with respect to these issues. For anybody who's not American and listening to me, I apologize if I sound a little bit too biased towards the American position, but that is the position from which I begin and the position I'd like to try to set out in this conversation. It's hard to talk about DSTs without going back to the beginning, Genesis 1 in the beginning. There are lots of folks who believe that there really isn't an international tax regime that's recognizable. I would say that that is not so, and that there is a clear set of international norms that has been recognized that goes back almost a century. It goes back to the 1920s, the League of Nations. And what the League of Nations settled on back then was that the right to tax cross-border income should be based on the value of activities taking place within a jurisdiction, the capital invested in that jurisdiction, and the assets provided. An alternative option that was put forward but not adopted, put forward interestingly by the business community but not adopted, was to tax profits in the market where the goods or services were sold. That system has stood in place for almost a century. And it was really not, I don't think, until the last probably 20 years or so that the system began to be questioned. There was a lot of concern about the ability of companies to arrange their affairs so as to minimize tax. There was concern about competition between countries to attract investment, which might take the form of a reduced tax rate. And at some point along the way, markets began to question the allocation of taxing rights with the view that there should be some right on the part of a market jurisdiction to tax some of the global profits of companies that were selling goods and services and therefore making money, becoming more valuable as on a global basis, having a higher stock market value from the operations in their country. So that ushered in an OECD project affectionately known as BEPS. BEPS standing for Base Erosion and Profit Shifting. I want to emphasize that S is for shifting, not sharing. But a lot of countries have thought, and indeed a lot of the commentary that you might read seems to assume that it stood for sharing as opposed to shifting. But so in the BEPS project, which the OECD started at the end of, really signaled that it was coming the end of 2011, the allocation of taxing rights was explicitly not on the table. And that's because the United States refused to have a conversation in what they viewed as a rather heated political environment of the issue of who should have the right to tax global profits. Not a statement that we were never going to take it up, but that this was not a good environment for doing it. If you think about BEPS, one of the things that Pascal Saint-Amand, who's the head of the tax function at the OECD, always said about the project, it was a financial crisis that led to an austerity crisis that led to a fiscal crisis that became a political crisis. And that was indeed what led to BEPS. So even though the reallocation of taxing rates was not explicitly on the table, it was clearly on below the table, below the surface. Maybe not overt, but covert. The conversations about BEPS had a lot to do with who had the right to tax global profits. Now, it's probably worth noting that there has always been a lot of political popularity for taxing someone else, right? If we can shift the burden of paying for something to somebody else, that's a good place to be. Former Senator Russell Long used to say, don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax the fellow behind the tree. Well, in modern day, that is, don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax the corporation across the sea. And in the case of BEPS, a lot of those corporations across the sea tend to be Americans. The US obviously enacted some fairly major tax reform in 2017. A lot of the tax reform that was enacted, despite the fact that it attracted no Democratic votes, had its origins in Democratic proposals, including from President Obama, Senator Max Baucus, who was the Democratic chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. That Tax Reform Act in 2017 picked up a lot of the recommendations that came out of the BEPS action items. It included limitations on interest deductions. It included not one, but two minimum taxes. It included anti-hybrid rules. So what it did was it picked up a lot of the concepts that had been put on the table in the BEPS process that countries should enact to protect their own tax base, and enacted them into law. It also significantly reduced the tax rate on US business, and it converted our system, which was nominally worldwide, to a nominal territorial system, and ended the disincentive for companies to repatriate earnings to the US from outside the US, so profits earned outside the US into the US, and it taxed all of those earnings on a current basis. So a lot of the conversation that gave rise to BEPS, I think, stemmed from the fact that US companies were required to report on their financial statements their foreign earnings that were treated as permanently reinvested. So amounts that were permanently reinvested showed up on the financial statements of all US companies, and those numbers tended to be very large, and they were growing larger as the years passed, because there was such a huge difference between the top US rate and the top rate in other countries that there was a real disincentive to repatriate those earnings back to the US, because if you left them offshore, they weren't taxed by the US. Once you brought them back on, you did pay the higher US tax rate. So when countries, the media, politicians, NGOs looked at the financial statements of US companies, what they saw was a very large and growing number, and that came to be thought of as untaxed profits. Now, the reality is that the only sense in which they were untaxed, they run through a tax system somewhere, in some cases multiple tax systems. The only sense in which they were untaxed was that they hadn't been taxed by the US, because under US rules, we didn't tax the profits until they were repatriated. But it gave rise to the notion that this was nowhere income, or this was stateless income, and made countries think that it was up for grabs, even though the reality was that it wasn't stateless, it wasn't nowhere income, it was US income, and we had merely deferred taxing it until such time as the companies brought the profits back to the US. But again, the political popularity of taxing someone else put that pot of gold on the table as something that countries wanted to go after and find a way to satisfy some of their revenue needs by taxing that. After the U.S. tax reform, the OECD looked at what was going on, saw a rising interest in on the part of non-U.S. governments in taxing the digital companies. That was something that the U.S. wanted to avoid. It was something that the U.S. stood strongly against during the BEPS process. It was actually something that the OECD agreed with, that there shouldn't be a ring fencing of the digital economy and a tax system that applied only to the digital economy. Nonetheless, there was a growing interest in the concept of digital services taxes. And so the US, in conversations with the OECD and the other members of the OECD, agreed that it was time to take another look at the international tax system, recognizing that the international tax system was unstable, and that as part of the 2017 tax reform, the US had enacted a provision referred to as the BEAT, Base Erosion and Anti-Abuse Tax, that's actually based on the market. And so what it does is it's a minimum tax, and it basically disallows deductions for payments that are to unrelated foreign party or to related foreign parties that exceed a certain threshold. So that kind of opened the door to a conversation about whether there should be some taxation on the basis of the market. So the OECD went to work on that and produced a report that set out 2 pillars to look at for rewriting the international tax rules. And again, this is from the US perspective, recognizing the instability, recognizing that US tax reform had put the concept of some tax on the basis of market on the table, but also a desire to stave off DSTs and to enhance the conversation going on around the globe about what the tax system ought to look like. So the OECD put forward a paper with 2 pillars, one of which is a specific reallocation of taxing rights to give some rights to tax global profits to the markets in which the revenues are generated. And then a second pillar, which is a minimum tax pillar, which picks up a couple of different proposals that look a lot like the 2 minimum taxes that the US enacted as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. Right now, there is discussion going on. As Meredith indicated, the US has withdrawn. That may be too strong a word. They are still at the table. They're still involved in the negotiations, but they have indicated that what's on the table as part of Pillar 1 is a bridge too far for us to be having a conversation about now. With all of the COVID-19 stuff going on. They're very much engaged in Pillar 2, which is the effort to draw up some global proposals that are based loosely on the GILTI and BEAT provisions of the US 2017 tax reform. The proposals were intended to be put on the table in sort of at least somewhat final form this month. That was delayed until October. You know, the Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, would like to see that delayed further, although I think he believes that the Pillar 2 minimum tax proposals could go forward. There's more agreement among the governments on the shape of those proposals than there is with respect to the reallocation of taxing rights that's part of Pillar 1. From my perspective, it doesn't look to me like any of this is going to stave off the digital services taxes. You know, just saying we need agreement at a global level about how global profits should be allocated if we want to ensure that there's cross-border flows of investment, that there's cross-border flows of trade. That just doesn't seem to be holding. And so instead what we seem to see is a move towards something that governments can enact without agreement on a global basis, which is this concept of a digital services tax. And the design of the digital services taxes, at least in most countries so far, seems to be pretty much aimed at US high-tech companies. Whether they expand beyond that, to be seen, but to the extent that it does, I think it's a bit of a misnomer to call it a digital services tax. I think the reality is that these are our first tariffs on services. So with that, I will pause.
Thank you, Pam. Really appreciate that. Can you just say a little bit about the politics of the US industries that are all looking at this negotiation? I think there's a big split between the digital folks and then maybe the more traditional industries, and kind of where they stand on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2.
Well, I don't think, so US industry, I don't think is eager to see either Pillar 1 or Pillar 2 go forward. Having it go forward would not be their first choice. On the other hand, the companies that are globally engaged are very much affected by the instability of the system, the risk of double taxation if countries enact conflicting or inconsistent proposals. So there's, I think, a general agreement that if there's going to be movement, companies would like to see it be uniform movement on the part of the OECD discussion participants. But as it stands right now, Pillar 1 is very much more aimed at the digital companies. There has been an effort to make it something that's not just targeted at US technology companies by the United States Treasury. That was done by bringing in the concept of reallocating the profits of consumer-facing companies. And that was something that was not welcomed by a lot of the consumer-facing companies that were not digital companies, because their view was, what did I do? How did I end up on the carving block here when I didn't do, none of my activities have given rise to the concerns that are floating around Europe and in capitals in other parts of the world as well. But so for a lot of companies who are just very concerned about the risk of double taxation, the increasing difficulty of resolving disputes between governments as to who gets to tax what, there is an interest in a stronger, more stable, more agreed system. But for the companies that haven't been caught in cross-border disputes, they would prefer not to be part of this at all. The minimum tax proposals from the perspective of US headquartered companies can only, I think, get worse than what they have under US law. There might be some competitive advantage to having companies headquartered in other countries subject to similar kinds of minimum tax rules, but that has really not been an animating factor, I don't think, in the discussion that we've had about the OECD BEPS 2.0 or digitalization project. One of the other things I think is interesting, Meredith, is that when you have conversations with non-US politicians about the digitalization project or about DSTs, what often comes out is a concern that is related to the fact that what they're seeing is automation that's eliminating jobs in their countries. And that all gets focused on US tech companies. But the reality is that it's just the world moving forward. And as the world moves forward, we're going to see an evolution that's going to take out some jobs while creating others. But the concern that they have is seeing jobs disappear in their countries and not knowing where the new jobs are going to come from or whether they're going to be in their countries.
Great, thank you. Grant, could you give us your perspective?
Sure, and thanks for Pam, because she set the table beautifully in the sense both of what this is as a tax and then what lies behind it. So let me start there, Meredith, and then I'll go into more of the trade-related details, including the most recent expansion of the Section 301 action by USTR. First and most important thing from a trade perspective is tax disputes are nothing new. You know, the original dispute inside the GATT way back in the early 50s was a complaint by the UK against Italy for subsidizing the sale of Italian tractors through their tax code. So it's been there from the beginning, and it pops up regularly. Obviously, the most long-running dispute in WTO GATT history was the DISC and FISC, which actually started in the early 60s. People don't realize that, particularly those who came along later in the stream and only dealt with the FISC, the loss of that case, and then the US legislation to modify it, which I have to say was a very different environment because the United States on something as significant as tax was complying with WTO dispute settlement at the time, very different than where we're at now. So nothing new, but the difference lies in the direction that Pam was going, which is that you've got multiple things going on. The rising cost of welfare states, while at the same time, the European countries relative to the United States have seen far lower productivity and economic growth. Obviously, there's an erosion of the tax base that goes along with slower growth. That's what drives a lot of what Pam was describing in terms of looking for other sources of revenue. And at the same time, in the face of competition from both US tech companies and China, what we've seen in Europe is the rise of a new mercantilism and the return of industrial policy. I don't know how many people have followed the discussions of the German Minister of Economy and Margrethe Vestager, who, while previously was responsible as the head of the Directorate of Competition with the European Commission, is now the Tsarina of the digital economy. And the sorts of things that are on the table would be reminiscent of the debates we had in the early 1980s about industrial policy. It never works, but it's always attractive politically. And let's be honest, we're not immune from that in the United States. Many of the Trump administration's policies move in that direction as well. So the times we're in are going to generate these kind of conflicts. The question is, how serious are they? And then what can we do to moderate them and move on to the kind of idea Pam was talking about, which would be an international tax system that created certainty and reduced the transaction costs of everybody participating in the global economy, not just, for example, US tech companies, but all of the thousands of exporters that use those platforms as a way of delivering goods and services around the globe. So with that as background, it's probably worth focusing on something Pam said, which is the nature of the measure. We tend to think of when anybody says tax dispute as if we're dealing with income taxes, but this is not an income tax. This is a tax on gross revenue. In other words, there's no offsetting of your costs. There's no ability to say, well, wait a minute, I earn more income here, lost income there. I need to even that out, which you see is the character that our tax code and tax codes around the world take on to make sure, A, there's a steady flow of revenue to the government, but also from the point of view of companies, that they have tools by which they can create some certainty themselves in terms of their own tax treatment. That's the ideal. And you can only say with the DSTs, we're very, very far from that ideal at this point. What this is, in fact, is a tariff, as Pam said, on services. What's unique about that is it's the first time anyone has ever applied a tariff to services. Now, we've had experiences, oftentimes troubling, of applying GSTs or value-added taxes to services. It's difficult, no doubt about that. This is the first shot at somebody applying a tariff. And you might argue, well, aren't tariffs, regulated by the WTO? Well, they are with respect to goods. That has been the main focus, but not on services. And there's a reason. The way we bargain inside the WTO is always informed by the fact that we are bargaining to remove the barriers we see exist. And there is a political trade-off in terms of the barriers of our own that we're willing to put on the table to try and reach a deal. You would not pay for removing a barrier that existed only hypothetically. That's just not the nature of the negotiating process on the trade side. So there is nothing in the general agreement on trade and services that actually prohibits the application of tariffs. That said, there are rules in the GATS about non-discrimination, which become relevant as a part of the discussion. But it's no great surprise in one sense that when people first reach to the WTO and say what's going on here, that they're a little surprised to find that a tariff on service is not something in and of itself is prohibited by the WTO. Now, I'm going to shift entirely at this point to the Section 301 action by USTR, because the best way to look at it is that it raises the question of how the DSTs fit within the broader trade framework, not just with respect to the GATS. And so what I thought I would do, Meredith, is just tick off the issues that this raises. And when you have to recognize that the United States, the USTR, has already made a decision about the French DST in the original Section 301 action. It's found it to be unreasonable and a burden on US commerce. And the question really is that the end of the inquiry? And the more you dig into it, the more you realize the answer to that is no. Now, there may be tactical reasons why USTR decided to take that approach, as you know, Meredith, well, from your experience implementing the Uruguay round and the dispute settlement procedures under 301. If you are arguing or asserting that there's a WTO violation, you're obliged to take it to dispute settlement under the particular agreement, whether it's a WTO agreement, whether it's a bilateral free trade agreement, or whatever form. It could be a bilateral investment treaty. But if you say there's a violation of a trade agreement, USTR is actually bound to go through the dispute settlement process. Given the fractious relationship between USTR and WTO on dispute settlement, you could argue that this was a tactical reason. But if you take a more rigorous analysis to what the DSTs are and how they fit, I just want to tick off a bunch of issues that immediately come to mind for somebody who is looking at the DST through fresh eyes. I will also say that when you go through that exercise, you can see why this is likely to be a protracted dispute. It's not something that's going to be easy to resolve. There's a series of novel questions, but it is one that is going to require a lot of effort on the part of both negotiators from the Treasury, from Pam's old shop on the tax side, as well as a pretty deft hand on the trade side as well. So I'm happy to go through this in greater detail in the questions, but just right off the top, while there is no prohibition in the GATS agreement on tariffs, France, the UK, and other European proponents of the DSTs have made a series of liberalization commitments under the GATS. And while the MFN obligation is something that's universal in both the GATT and the GATS, in the GATS, the national treatment obligation is only due and owing where you've agreed to liberalize. Well, in the case of these countries, they've agreed to liberalize in areas that would apply both to the platform services that tech companies provide, as well as to the advertising services that are the revenue stream that the DSTs go after. And so one form or another, you would expect to see an argument that said, well, wait a minute, just based on rules of non-discrimination, both MFN and national treatment in this case, don't we have a significant issue in terms of certainly the French DST, the British DST, the Czech DST, and the other sorts of European proposals, including the Commission's own proposal as a part of this process. Now, you can go further than that, because in the case of India, they're not only applying the DST to services and advertising revenues, they're also applying it to actual goods sold over the internet or through e-commerce. And there you have a classic violation of GATT rules. It's not because of the Indian tariff bindings, product by product, you may find that because they're so high, and because we've never pressed India to make the kind of concessions that other countries have, you will see that many of these things may not actually violate the Indian tariff bindings. but they are subject again to the rules of MFN and national treatment. And clearly in both these instances, whether it's the European model or it's the Indian model under the GATT, you have relatively clear violations, de facto discrimination against the US companies. The interesting twist on it, again, the deeper you look into it, is this is an issue not just for the high-tech companies, but it's an issue for the companies that use those platforms as well. And that I would expect will come into play as a part of the discussion as the 301 goes on further. Now, more broadly, what I would say is the DSTs offer a textbook example of when you would use non-violation nullification impairment. And for people that don't know that part of the trade universe, what that is it's a little bit like contract law, where one of the parties takes some actions that frustrate the purpose of the contract. And so this is an instance where you can go after things that may not necessarily violate the specific terms of the GATT or the GATS, but undermine the agreement and the reasonable expectations of market access the United States had. And that's one area where the implications for all of the users, US users of these platforms, if you think about Amazon in particular, selling goods and services via the Amazon platform, are at risk. And the argument's more compelling in many respects, because while the Europeans often describe this as an effort to protect the little guys from the big guys, it ignores the fact that these are platforms whereby our little guys actually engage in European commerce. So to look at this as just a question of the high-tech companies is satisfying as a rhetorical matter, but when you actually look at the substance and the impact, it's a very different story. Now, outside of the context of the WTO, you have to realize that Section 301 actually doesn't limit the definition of what a trade agreement is. And so that sweeps in a number of measures. Among those, I would include two that the DSTs necessarily violate. One is the agreement among all the OECD countries in the context of transfer pricing guidelines not to use formulary apportionment as a way of taxing income. And without going deeply into what formulary apportionment is, we do have a tax here that is essentially trying to look at the global revenue of these companies and take a share. That's classic formulary apportionment, rather than actually trying to look at the income and then, as Pam described, allocate it based on the existing tax rules. There's an irony in that too, because somebody who was a lot younger and lighter that looked like me was on something called the Unitary Tax Working Group when he was a young Foreign Service officer working for Alan Wallace and George Shultz. And that was a conflict brought about by French and British complaints about our estates using formulary apportionment. So the irony is that most of the arguments the Europeans are using here are actually arguments we've heard before by the state of California, the state of Utah, and the state of North Dakota. One of the sweet ironies of this, Meredith, is that one member, which Ken will relate to, one of the members of the Finance Committee when Ken and I were there was the senator from North Dakota, Kent Conrad, who had previously been the tax commissioner trying to implement unitary taxation. So I first met him in like 1982, arguing over these exact issues. Well, now the shoe's on the other foot, and the French in particular Minister Bruno Maire, is making a series of arguments which are, I think the polite term would be Janus-faced, in the sense that we've covered this ground before, but in opposite positions. But that hasn't stopped the minister from continuing to make the arguments. Now, as people may know, under 301, it reaches well beyond the nature of just trade agreement violations. It also allows action by the USTR and the president where violations, I shouldn't say violations, I should say actions, policies, or practices of other governments are unjustifiable, unreasonable, and a burden or restriction on US commerce. And in the unjustifiable category, one of the interesting things is that the DSTs form a fairly clear violation of customary principles of international law that limit the taxing jurisdiction of countries. more broadly, it limits their what's known among international lawyers as their prescriptive jurisdiction, their ability to prescribe law that applies to individuals or companies beyond their territory. And the question is always whether it's extraterritorial. So the basic rule under international law is that for a country to assert its jurisdiction, tax or otherwise, there has to be a quote unquote genuine connection between the activities of the foreign party and the geography, the territory of the regulating jurisdiction, which is not present here. And if you think about what Pam was describing about tax rules, the need to establish a permanent establishment, quote unquote, a PE as it's known among tax jargons, as the basis for asserting taxing rights is a reflection of that rule in customary international law that you have to have a genuine connection. So to the extent which the Europeans freely admit they are eroding that standard and want to change the rules of what constitutes a permanent establishment, they're conceding that they're violating customary international law and the rules that limit the prescriptive jurisdiction. Now, in one sense, this is probably unsurprising. If you view this exercise in tax from a US-European perspective, the Europeans have been going after the high-tech companies through a lot of different angles over time. Certainly the regulation of data flows, Margareta Vestager's state aid investigations. As recently as 2 days ago in the Financial Times, there was another broad attempt about how to regulate the companies generally. And it would be unsurprising if from an American perspective, you didn't look at this as one element of a broader strategy designed to advance the interests of European companies relative to the American competition. And the extent to which you're violating customary international law in service of that end is a pretty serious problem. And just to give a little more detail to that, the thing about customary international law is it means what's readily accepted by the great mass of countries, nation states. And once you start to modify the rules, you can be modifying the rules with respect to prescriptive jurisdiction along a broad front, all of which European companies as well as US companies depend on for certainty in terms of how they approach the global market, how they approach exporting, how they approach investing abroad, things of that nature. So what the Europeans are doing is actually eroding some of the basic certainties that are built into the system of international law, not just on the tax side, not just violation of trade agreements. And that makes this a far more serious avenue that they're pursuing than what they did with competition policy or the state aid investigations or data regulation. Lastly, just to put a cap on it, when you think about the reasonability of what's going on here, one of the odd things about this is the lack of any effort to actually find something which trade people are familiar with, the obligation to pursue the least trade restrictive means of achieving your end. And if the idea is to tax European customers in their terms of what they purchase over these services and find their way to addressing the transactions, you can find ways to apply a tax or a fee in terms of the telecom provider that is the last mile connection with respect to these services in Europe, and you wouldn't violate either the WTO or the international tax rules. And that's where I think it comes back to what Pam was describing about the motive here about taxing that corporation over the sea. You can see the political fallout from trying to impose an additional tax on European consumers relative to the attraction of saying that we're going to impose a tax on these bad US companies as a part of it. Now, the last point is about the actual amount of economic harm. Simple addition, if you just go through the countries that have stated what their rate, what their handful of revenue would be from the US companies, just those that have done that, which is not the whole number in the USTR's investigation, already amounts to 30% of the US companies' revenue from the services they provide internationally. So it won't take much in the way of additional DSTs to consume more than 100% of the revenue that these companies generate from these services. And that's a great point to end on, because one of the things that we should be thinking about whether there's a reasonable approach to taxing whatever is available, as Pam was talking about, in terms of defining permanent establishment differently, it should not result in companies taking more than 100% of the revenue that any corporation earns. Not just from the point of view what they do internationally, but their entire revenue. You know, per se, you're dealing with something that's unreasonable under those circumstances and deeply troubling, but also very powerfully attractive as countries, and I'm not excluding the United States from this, are going to face the need to pay what we've been putting out in terms of an appropriate response to COVID-19. But when that bill comes due, we're all going to be looking for a broader tax base. So I expect this is going to be a problem that's going to metastasize for a long period of time, and it'll generate the kind of conflict we had with FISC and DISC. Thanks, Meredith.
Whoa, that was a terrific presentation, both you guys, very tight and full. And we really appreciate it. One question about the Ways and Means Senate Finance politics on this. It was really remarkable to me how united the members were with Ambassador Lighthizer 2 weeks ago in terms of the retaliation prospects against the Europeans, very, very dug in support of what his strategy was. I did hear Mr. Doggett, I think, on the Democratic side, made some mention that, well, we all need to decide how to tax these companies. And so is there a lot of domestic interest in maybe having companies that have done so well during the COVID experience pay a little more in taxes domestically? And is that part of this whole mix?
You know, there are a lot of different ways that different things that be looked at. And I think one of the things that's going to be looked at, it's already been considered and vetoed in Maryland, as a digital services tax in Maryland. I think there's some conversation going on about one up in New York at this point as well. And then there's you know, there are other things like excess profits tax. Now, one of the things that's curious about the whole conversation that's going on about how profitable the high tech companies have been during this period is that people are looking at revenues. So they're looking at, you know, what Grant was talking about a minute ago. They're looking at the revenues that are being collected and not what's falling to the bottom line. So there's, you know, in the political realm, the media realm, the populist realm, there's a huge disconnect in understanding that revenues are not equal to profits, are not equal to tax base, and they're certainly not equal to market cap. And there are a lot of companies that appear to be doing very well if you look at what's going on in the stock market, but that's not because they've suddenly become enormously profitable. A whole lot of the companies that are generating a lot in revenues are also generating a whole lot in terms of additional costs that they've had to incur in order to strengthen their systems, take on additional staff, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just a, you know, very large disconnect. Just gonna say one other thing about the DST, and that's that it is, we have spent as many decades studying different forms of consumption taxation, like value-added taxes or digital services taxes, as we have studying income taxes. And the DST would go on the list as one of the most poorly designed taxes. It's like a US sales tax, and we all recognize, in the tax world at least, that a sales tax is not a good tax base. That's why there's been so much work on the value-added tax or the goods and services taxes, is to construct a better economically functioning tax, and the DST is not that.
Okay.
Need to unmute Meredith. It's
no, I'm.
all right if we take some audience questions.
Yeah, absolutely. This is from, can you hear me?
I actually want to ask one myself. I want to start with a real basic one, if I could. And Pam, maybe it's just maybe my lack of understanding a little bit, but so we're doing these Zoom webinars and they're free at the moment. And we've not charged, and we have a global audience. We have people all over the world watching these webinars. WITA's deriving no revenue from it. Zoom gets my subscription revenue for having a webinar subscription, a monthly subscription. would I theoretically be subject to a tax? So question one, would Zoom be subject to any tax on people using this Zoom service in a country that starts a DST? But second, if I start charging nominal amount, let's say $10 US for non-WITA members to watch one of our webinars, someone in Brussels decides to pay that $10. Is WITA, we're a nonprofit, but let's get away from that for a second. Would we be subject to a potential tax on a DST because we're providing a digital service, presumably? Is something even that small? I mean, I don't know if there's de minimis rules, but theoretically, just is that something, one of the either of these situations, one where there's a tax under some of these models?
You know, the digital services tax models are not all the same. And so it's certainly conceivable that there's going to be some that are going to pick those revenues up and subject them to tax. But, you know, one of the things that's interesting is that as the world has become more digital on the value-added tax, goods and services tax side in particular, a lot of effort has gone into sourcing which government has the right to tax which revenues. You know, Grant was over in, I think it was Hong Kong a couple of years ago, and we had a conversation that was tied into what was going on in the whole digital discussion about the fact that he had been in a cab listening to some music, thought I would like it, Shazammed it, and then got the artist's name and ordered CDs. Okay, who gets to tax that and where? Because the listening and the ordering occurred in Hong Kong, but the order was placed in Seattle and it was delivered to me in Virginia. You know, I mean, those are sort of the complexities that we deal with our increased global interaction. And it's one of the reasons that we need very clear rules about who gets to tax what and on what basis. But, you know, if countries just move forward with the idea of a digital services tax, and then they look for a revenue flow out of their country, you know, you may see them trying to impose that. And, you know, we've had a history now of several years where we have had taxes enacted by foreign governments, not digital services taxes, but other kinds of similar taxes that have, you know, popularly been named for US tech giants. And so that's, you know, this is another one in this continuing saga as we try to sort out who has the right to tax what and when.
So Ken, I'd have a little different response based on the difference between the French DST and the Indian DST. So the French DST does have a de minimis rule, which is very high, which is one of the reasons why de facto this is targeting just the high tech US companies. India, on the other hand, if you look at the exchange rate equivalent of the rupee level that's applied, WITA would be covered. Trust me, buddy. You know, so you have this disparity. Exactly. And to take WITA's situation, then apply it to the fact that if you did, a good friend of ours who you know, Christine McDaniel, has been doing some work in terms of input-output tables, just to get an understanding of to what extent digital is a part of every company at this point. And let me take it all the way down from a development perspective to the African in Zambia that is growing bananas and uses his phone to understand the market price and sell them into a global market, right? There's a digital component to that farmer's business. Well, there's no logical limit to these DSTs. If you're a consumer goods company that is selling into a market and information is coming back to you from your goods and services about the consumer in that country, you could be swept up on this. And the only thing that's saving you is the fact that the European DSTs are very focused on these high-tech companies. But you can see if what's driving this is the pursuit of revenue, this is why I get so concerned about it, Ken, because there is no premise in law, economics, or maybe most importantly, logic that limits this.
So can I jump in a sec? And this, I'm going to tie together about 4 of the questions that have come in. And I apologize, there's already 13 and we only have a few minutes left. But you know, once a tax is imposed and once taxing jurisdictions start bringing in revenue, it's really hard to cut off that revenue stream. So we're on the precipice, it feels like, of jumping off a cliff with all these different regimes. Are we setting ourselves up for a protracted dispute that's going to go, that could be a bit like the Fisk ETI, which went on for years, that this could go on for years? At the same time, we have the WTO kind of teetering in a lot of ways on its dispute functioning. And we're going to be in some sort of tit for tat situations. I mean, Pam, somebody even brought up, I don't understand it, but it was in one of the questions about Section 891, where we can have like a reciprocal tax on another jurisdiction. If they tax us and we deem it unjustly, we can tax them back. I mean, are we setting up for years of disputes in this, in jurisdictions all over the world, trying to sort this out if we can't come to, like we were talking about this OECD, some sort of basic set of rules? And I know, Grant, you've had some questions about that OECD process. We had a question come in from someone in California saying, the US pulled out, but we have a lot of these tech companies in California. Do we have a voice at the OECD process? So, you know, that was another question that came in. So I know a lot I'm trying to tie together with this, but we're right on the edge of our time, and we're right on the edge of the DSTs kind of taking over the world. How do we get away from this crisis that's looming?
So, you know, I think of this as Hegelian dialectics. You know, you have thesis, you have antithesis, and you have synthesis. And we're trying to rush too fast to get to synthesis. We've got a system that's been in place for 100 years. There's discomfort, dislike of the system. We need to change the system. We will change the system. But trying to, I'm very sympathetic with Secretary Mnuchin's tapping on the brakes, because we shouldn't be trying to solve this between now and the end of this year, because there's just no way we're going to get to agreement on it. You know, the reality with respect to the US is that the US is going to be giving up revenue if we move forward with Pillar 1. Well, I don't think the US is ready at this point. I don't think any government is ready at this point to be giving up revenue. That kind of goes back to your point about, you know, are we at the precipice? Once countries start enacting, they already have started enacting, but once they start collecting the DST revenue, how are you going to turn it off? And then the reality with, as Grant said, the thresholds that are in a lot of the laws that are very high, it's not going to produce that much in the way of revenue, particularly when you look at the revenue that they're going to need in order to dig themselves out of the COVID holes that we've all created. And so to fill let's stop digging. Let's start filling the holes. But so that means that you inevitably have to think about how it expands. And perhaps that expands in part by expanding the reach of the DST, so it's not limited to the very largest US tech companies, but it starts picking up, you know, the less large, medium-sized, and then eventually the smaller businesses. But then you also have to think about putting at risk other kinds of cross-border flows. So we've got the IMF, I think dangerously suggesting that developing countries should back out of their tax treaties, that imposing withholding taxes is a good way for them to go. Well, you know, we've spent a whole lot of time beating down withholding taxes because they were, you know, they stopped cross-border trade and investment. They were not a good thing. And now we've suddenly got a lot of movement in the other direction. So if the DST takes off, you know, watch out for that to spread to other cross-border flows.
I gotta say, I'm just so tempted, Ken, knowing your background, to pick up on Pam's reference to Hegel, because, you know, we tend to forget that the new Hegelians wanted to overturn Hegel and focus it on material things, the most famous of which was Karl Marx, right? And the most important thing to understand is the extent to which many of the concepts at play here have the same sort of feeling. Like I did this when I woke up in the middle of the night, which, you know, all of you who know me are going to say it sounds a lot like Grant. I pull out my phone, and the French have said that we have to impose this DST because our consumers are adding value to the transactions, so therefore we're due something as a part of these revenues. So just for kicks, I signed on to thesaurus.com and looked at the antonym of produce, which is consume, right? You know, I mean, we're in a world where the language that supports this is Jacques Derrida, and that is deeply inconsistent with the idea of a system that actually allow investment to flow and create opportunity. And what I worry so much about this, and I think you're right, Ken, at what you're hinting at, is that it will metastasize, is that we tend to forget that at times like COVID-19, the most important thing to be able to pay for a broader suite of services for the American public, as well as any other public, is a healthy growing economy. So anybody who has a liberal perspective about what government should be doing ought to be enthused about the idea of tax policies that spur growth. This is the opposite, but we're headed down this path.
So we're hit the bewitching hour. We've gone over by a minute. I need to apologize to our viewers. We have 14 questions we didn't get to, but what we can do is download them, and I'm going to forward them to Grant and Pam and see if we can get to some of those other answers. And maybe I know there's some kind words from some old friends, it seems like, in here too, reaching out through the Q&A, Grant and Pam. So hopefully we can get to some of those. So thank you all very much. Meredith, any final words?
Yeah, I want to thank for the privilege of serving as your marriage counselor of the tax and the quick world this hour. And I think you've done very well, and we really appreciate your analysis.
Thanks, Meredith.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you.
I knew if I hadn't known you two were married before this session, when you both bring up Hegelian thought dialectics, it brought it all home. Now I understand how the dinner table conversation goes in your household and why your son had that first email address. Very grateful to all of you. This is such a deep topic. I do want to tell everybody who's watching before you sign off, we did reach out to several European countries to take part in this session. They were not available or prepared at this time to talk to us about this, but we are going to invite them back again. And we'll try to have an opportunity for them to present why they think this is a good idea, and have a bit of a dialectic about the positive and negatives about some of these ideas. So we are going to try to invite them, and I apologize that we weren't able to bring them on this session today. Thank you very much. Thank you, Meredith, for helping bring this idea to WITA. Grant and Pam, thank you so much for doing this. Really grateful, and hope you're all taking care. And everybody out there, please wear a mask.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.